January 17, 1945. Beneath the frozen streets of Munich. The cold bit harder underground than it did in the open air. In the narrow cellar beneath a bombed-out bookshop on Schellingstrasse, Margarete Hoffman pressed her back against the damp stone wall and tried to stop her hands from shaking. Not from fear, though fear was always there, coiled tight in her chest like barbed wire, but from the cold that had seeped into her bones over 3 winters of resistance. The cellar smelled of mildew, old paper, and something metallic that might have been blood or rust, or simply the scent of a city eating itself from within. Above them, Munich slept fitfully under the watch of the Gestapo. Below, in the darkness, punctuated only by a single oil lamp burning low, 5 women and 2 men huddled around a table made from a door torn from its hinges, planning the distribution of forged ration cards that might keep a dozen Jewish families alive for another month. Margarete was 26 years old. She had been a university student once, studying literature, dreaming of teaching poetry to children in peaceful classrooms filled with light. That woman felt like a ghost now, a shadow from a life that belonged to someone else. The woman she had become wore a threadbare coat over 2 layers of sweaters, carried false identity papers in 3 different names, and knew 17 routes through Munich's bombed-out districts that the patrols rarely checked. She knew how to forge signatures, how to move silently through rubble, how to lie with absolute conviction to men who would kill her without hesitation. She knew the weight of a pistol, though she had never fired one. She knew hunger as an intimate companion, a presence that hollowed out your thoughts and made every decision both sharper and more desperate. What she did not know, could not possibly have known on that frozen January night, was that within 6 months she would be sitting in a clean, warm room in Frankfurt, eating chicken soup from a ceramic bowl, served by American soldiers who smiled at her like she was a human being worthy of care. That image would have seemed more fantastical than any fairy tale she had once read to her younger siblings, before the war had scattered her family like seeds in a storm. The German resistance was never monolithic. History would later struggle to church groups, communist cells, individual saboteurs who acted alone because trust had become the most dangerous luxury. They operated in a nation where neighbours informed on neighbours, where children were taught to report their parents, where the machinery of surveillance had become so thorough that resistance often meant simply refusing to participate, protecting one small life at a time, maintaining some fragment of humanity in a system designed to extinguish it. For women in the resistance, the danger carried particular dimensions. The Gestapo did not distinguish between male and female conspirators when it came to interrogation, torture, or execution. If anything, female resistors faced additional vulnerabilities: the threat of sexual violence, the assumption that women would break more easily under pressure, the cruel exploitation of maternal instincts. And yet women formed perhaps 40% of the resistance networks, serving as couriers, forgers, safe house operators, intelligence gatherers. They moved through the city with less suspicion than men of military age. They maintained the networks when the men were arrested or conscripted. They kept the fragile threads of opposition alive through sheer, stubborn endurance. Margarete had joined the resistance in 1942, after the deportation of her closest friend, Sarah Lieberman, a Jewish classmate whose family had lived in Munich for 3 generations. Sarah's parents had believed their status as decorated veterans of the Great War would protect them. They were wrong. Margarete had watched through her apartment window as the Liebermans were loaded into trucks, Sarah's mother still wearing her apron, her father clutching the iron cross he had earned at Verdun, as if it were a talisman that might still mean something. It meant nothing. They disappeared into the machinery of the final solution, and Margarete understood with sudden terrible clarity that there was no neutrality, no safe passivity, no way to remain clean while the world burned around you. She had expected, when she first made contact with the resistance cell through a former professor who whispered an invitation during a chance meeting, that she would find warriors. Brave, certainly, but also well-fed, well-organized, equipped with resources and plans and some sense of military structure. Instead, she found people as desperate and hungry as everyone else, perhaps more so. A feast meant potatoes, and if they were extraordinarily fortunate, a bit of margarine. By January 1945, the situation had become catastrophic. Allied bombing had destroyed much of Munich's infrastructure. Food supplies had dwindled to near starvation levels, even for ordinary citizens with proper rations. For the resistance, operating in the shadows, stealing moments between patrols and raids, meals had become an afterthought, a luxury they could rarely afford. Margarete could not remember the last time she had felt truly full. Her hip bones pressed against her skirt. Her menstrual cycle had stopped months ago, her body shutting down non-essential functions to preserve whatever energy remained. When she looked at her reflection in broken windows, the mirrors in her apartment had been destroyed in a bombing raid. She saw a stranger with hollow cheeks and dark circles that made her look 20 years older. They had been told, in whispers passed through the network, that the Americans were coming, that the Western Front was collapsing, that liberation was a matter of months, perhaps weeks. But liberation felt like an abstraction, a rumor too wonderful to believe. What felt real was the cold, the hunger, the constant fear, the exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness into something existential, a weariness of the soul. What felt real was the knowledge that any day might bring the knock on the door, the rough hands, the basement interrogation rooms in Gestapo headquarters where screams echoed and people disappeared. Margarete did not think about survival in grand terms. She thought about the next hour, the next forged document, the next family that might be saved. She thought about the pistol hidden in her apartment, the one she had promised herself she would use on herself before she would let them take her alive to talk under torture. She thought about her younger brother, conscripted into the Wehrmacht and last heard from somewhere on the Eastern Front, probably dead, though no confirmation had arrived. She did not think about hot meals. That was a memory from another lifetime, as distant as childhood Christmas dinners or Sunday afternoon coffee cakes at her grandmother's house. The war had taught her to expect nothing, to hope for nothing, to simply endure, day by day, until endurance itself became a form of resistance. Munich, once the birthplace of National Socialism, the city where Hitler had staged his failed beer hall putsch, the spiritual heart of the Nazi movement, now found itself in the path of the American 7th Army's rapid advance. The city's leadership faced a choice: defend to the last man and see Munich reduced to rubble like so many other German cities, or surrender and spare what remained. On April 30th, 1945, the same day Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker, American troops entered Munich. The resistance, which had been preparing for a final, desperate uprising, instead found themselves greeting liberators. For Margarete and thousands like her, the moment carried a surreal quality, as if they had stepped through a membrane separating one reality from another. The soldiers who entered the city wore clean uniforms, carried themselves with the casual confidence of men who knew the war was won, and brought with them something the Germans had almost forgotten existed: abundance. The contrast was immediate and overwhelming. Margarete first encountered American soldiers on May 2nd, 2 days after the city's fall, when she emerged from hiding to assess the situation. She had expected, what? Vengeance, perhaps? Anger? The kind of brutal occupation the Wehrmacht had inflicted on conquered territories. She had heard the propaganda about American barbarism, about how the Allied forces would rape and pillage and destroy. Even though she had long since stopped believing Nazi lies, some residual fear remained. These were, after all, the enemy. They had been bombing German cities for years. Surely they would arrive with hatred in their hearts. Instead, the first American she spoke to, a young corporal from Illinois who was helping direct civilian traffic away from a damaged bridge, offered her a chocolate bar. She stared at it, uncomprehending. Chocolate. Real chocolate. Not the ersatz sawdust mixture that had been sold in Munich stores for the past year. The corporal, misinterpreting her hesitation, smiled and made an encouraging gesture. "Go ahead, miss. It's okay. You folks look like you could use it." She took the chocolate with trembling hands and immediately broke it into pieces to share with the others in her group. The taste exploded in her mouth, rich and sweet and impossibly real. What came next would fundamentally alter Margarita's understanding of what was possible, what an occupying army could be, what values could be embedded in military logistics. The Americans, she soon learned, had a policy. It had been planned, debated, and implemented with characteristic American thoroughness. Germany would not be left to starve. The population, even the former enemy, would be fed. It was partly strategic. Hungry, desperate populations bred disease and instability, and partly ideological, rooted in American beliefs about human dignity and the moral obligations of the victor. But for the Germans experiencing it, the reasoning mattered less than the reality. Within days of Munich's liberation, the American military government began establishing feeding centers. These were not punitive installations or bare minimum survival operations. They were organized, efficient systems designed to provide actual nutrition, served with a decorum that shocked the recipients. Margarete first entered one such center in mid-May, accompanying a group of former resistance members who had been invited by an American officer conducting outreach to anti-Nazi Germans. She walked into what had been a school cafeteria, now operated by the US Army, and stopped in the doorway, overwhelmed. The room was clean, genuinely clean, with floors that had been mopped and tables that had been scrubbed. It was warm, heated by military generators, and the smell was extraordinary, almost painful in its richness. Cooking meat, real bread, coffee, actual coffee, not the grain-based substitute that had passed for the beverage in Germany. Vegetables, the scent of food being prepared with care and plenty. The line moved efficiently. No shoving, no chaos, no desperate scrambling. American soldiers and German volunteers served the meals with assembly line precision, ladling soup into bowls, placing bread on trays, pouring drinks. When Margarete reached the front of the line, a young African-American soldier smiled at her and handed her a tray. On it, a bowl of chicken soup with visible pieces of meat and vegetables, 2 slices of white bread with real butter, a cup of coffee with sugar and milk, and a small apple. She carried the tray to a table and sat down, unable to eat immediately, simply staring at the food. When Margarete finally lifted the spoon to her lips and tasted the soup, hot and rich and nourishing, she felt something inside her crack open. It was not just the food, though the food was extraordinary. It was what the food represented. These Americans, who had every right to let them starve, who had lost thousands of their own men fighting Germany, were feeding them. Not scraps, not punishment rations, but real meals, served with basic human dignity. They did not interrogate her about her past. They did not demand papers or proof of anti-Nazi credentials. They simply fed her because she was hungry and they had food, and that, apparently, was reason enough. The woman she had been 3 years ago, the literature student who had studied poetry and philosophy, found words for it that the exhausted resistance fighter could not. This was grace. Unearned, undeserved, freely given. This was what the philosophers had meant when they wrote about human dignity, about the obligations of the powerful to the powerless, about mercy that transcends justice. The meals continued, not just for days but for weeks and months as the occupation stabilized and the American military government established a more permanent presence. The feeding centers became anchors in the chaos of post-war Munich, places of reliability in a world where so much had proven unreliable. Margarete found herself returning daily, not just for the food, though her body was desperate for nutrition, but for the atmosphere, for the strange new experience of being treated as a human being by the very soldiers who had defeated her nation. She began to notice details. The Americans were not simply dumping food at the Germans and walking away. They seemed genuinely concerned about nutrition, about public health, about rebuilding, not just buildings but people. Military doctors checked for malnutrition and disease. Nutritionists monitored the feeding programs to ensure proper balance. The meals were calibrated to bring starved bodies back to health gradually, avoiding the refeeding syndrome that could kill people whose systems had adapted to prolonged hunger. And the soldiers themselves, these young men from places Margarete had never heard of, Iowa, Texas, California, New York, treated the Germans with a curious mixture of firmness and friendliness. They were clearly the victors. They seemed, if anything, slightly uncomfortable with the role of occupiers, as if they would rather be home, but since they were here, they might as well be decent about it. One American in particular caught Margarete's attention. Sergeant William Harrison, a logistics officer from Michigan, ran one of the main feeding centers with extraordinary efficiency and unexpected warmth. He was perhaps 30 years old, with reddish hair and a face weathered by years of war, but still capable of easy smiles. He spoke a bit of fractured German and was learning more, making earnest attempts to communicate that often resulted in comical misunderstandings, but always conveyed genuine goodwill. Margarete, whose English was better than most, a legacy of her university education, found herself volunteering to help translate and coordinate between the Americans and the German population. It was through this work that she came to understand just how thoroughly the American military had planned for this phase of the occupation. Harrison showed her the logistics manuals, the supply chains, the careful calculations of calories and nutrition. The Americans had been planning to feed Germany even while they were still fighting Germany. They had brought shiploads of food across the Atlantic, stockpiled supplies, organized distribution networks, all in preparation for the occupation. "We learned from last time," Harrison explained one afternoon, standing in the center's storage room surrounded by crates of canned goods and sacks of flour. His German was improving. After the Great War, Germany starved. The blockade, the reparations, all of it, made people desperate, made them angry, made them listen to— He paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing. Made them listen to the wrong people. President Roosevelt, he said we wouldn't make that mistake again. Feed the people, help them rebuild, show them there's a better way. Margarete translated his words for a group of German volunteers, but she was thinking about the implications. The Americans believed that how you treated the defeated mattered, that mercy was not weakness but strategy, that abundance shared became a form of propaganda more powerful than any poster or radio broadcast. Every meal served, every kindness extended, every moment of dignity preserved, became an argument against everything the Nazi regime had represented. The meals themselves became a— The Americans did not seem to care about class or status or political history. If you were hungry and you came to the center, you were fed. It was, Margarete realized, a practical demonstration of the democratic ideals she had only read about in banned books and whispered conversations. Not equality of outcome, but equality of basic human worth. Not punishment based on collective guilt, but individual accountability combined with universal care for basic needs. She watched how the experience transformed people. The first few visits, Germans approached the feeding centers with suspicion and shame, the bitterness of defeat heavy on their shoulders. But after several meals, after repeated interactions with American soldiers who treated them with basic decency, something shifted. People began to talk to each other, to share stories, to rebuild the social connections that years of fear and informing had shattered. The feeding centers became community spaces, places where Munich began to knit itself back together. And the women of the resistance, Margarete's companions who had lived in the shadows for so long, found themselves experiencing a particularly profound transformation. They had spent years being hunted, hiding, constantly afraid. They had lived on the absolute edge of survival, always one mistake away from death. Now they sat in warm rooms, eating hot meals, treated with respect by the liberating forces. The psychological impact was profound. For the first time in years, they felt safe enough to think beyond immediate survival, to consider futures, to imagine lives that might involve something other than fear and resistance. Margarete met regularly with her former resistance cell, now gradually emerging from hiding. They gathered in the feeding center sometimes, recognizing the bitter irony. They had huddled in freezing cellars, eating scraps, while planning resistance. And now they sat in comfort, eating American chicken soup, while discussing what to do with peace. The conversations were complicated, full of guilt and relief and confusion. Many felt they should not accept American help, that as Germans they bore collective responsibility for the war and should suffer the consequences. But the Americans seemed uninterested in that kind of collective punishment. They had come to feed people, to rebuild, to move forward. "It's not charity," Harrison explained to Margarete when she raised. It was a profoundly American way of thinking, Margarete reflected. Pragmatic, forward-looking, optimistic in a way that seemed almost naive to Germans who had lived through the darkness of the past decade. But there was wisdom in it too. The Americans understood something that the Nazis never had, that power was not just about force, but about attraction. That the image of American soldiers serving hot meals to former enemies was worth more than 1,000 propaganda films. That generosity, strategic or not, could reshape perceptions and loyalties in ways that violence never could. By summer of 1945, the initial chaos of occupation had settled into routine. The feeding centers continued, though they were gradually being supplemented by restored German food production and supply networks. Margarete had become a semi-official liaison between the American military government and the civilian population, using her language skills and her credibility as a resistance member to help bridge the gap between occupiers and occupied. She had gained weight, filled out the hollows in her cheeks, recovered the energy that had been slowly draining away during the war years. Her menstrual cycle had returned, her body recognizing that it was safe to support life again. She could think clearly, plan beyond the next day, imagine a future. The transformation was not just physical. Something had shifted in her understanding of the world, of what was possible in human affairs. She had been raised in a Germany that glorified strength, that saw compassion as weakness, that believed in hierarchy and domination and the survival of the fittest. The Nazi ideology had been an extreme version of this, but the roots went deeper, into German military tradition, into philosophical currents that exalted the will to power, and dismissed mercy as sentimental foolishness. Even her own resistance had been born partly from this tradition, the desire to fight, to struggle against overwhelming odds, to prove oneself through opposition. The American approach seemed to come from a different philosophical universe entirely. They believed in plenty, not scarcity, in cooperation, not domination, in the possibility of redemption and transformation. They fed their enemies not because they were weak, but because they were strong enough to afford generosity. They established democracy not by forcing it at gunpoint, but by demonstrating its benefits through practice. The feeding center had closed for the day, but they sat in the courtyard outside, enjoying the warm summer air. Harrison was smoking a cigarette and working on his German grammar, occasionally asking Margarete to correct his pronunciation. The conversation drifted to philosophy, to questions of why nations behaved as they did, why some chose paths of aggression and others chose paths of cooperation. "My grandfather," Harrison said slowly, carefully constructing his German sentences, "came from Germany, 1882, went to America because he was hungry, because there was no future in his village. In America he got land, got opportunity. He always said America gave him a chance to be someone, not because of his name or his family, but because of what he could do." He paused, taking a drag on his cigarette. I think that's what we're trying to do here. Give Germany a chance to be something different, not because of what you were, but because of what you might become. Margarete translated his words in her mind, considering them from multiple angles. It was an American story, an immigrant narrative, the kind of thing that would have been dismissed as naive sentimentality in the Germany she had grown up in. But there was power in that story too, in the belief that identity was not fixed, that nations and people could change, that the past did not have to determine the future. Your grandfather, she said carefully, also working on her English. He would be proud, I think, that you came back to give Germans the same chance. Harrison smiled, a little embarrassed. Maybe. Or maybe he'd think I was crazy, feeding the people who started this whole mess. He shook his head. But that's not how we see it. You didn't start this. The people we fed, they're not the ones who decided to invade Poland or murder millions of innocent people. They're just people who got caught up in something terrible. And now they're hungry, and we have food, so we feed them. It's not complicated. But it was complicated, Margarete thought. It was profoundly complicated, this question of guilt and innocence, complicity and resistance, punishment and mercy. The Nazis had tried to make it simple, to divide the world into us and them, superior and in. Some had been committed anti-Nazis from the beginning, had never been seduced by Hitler's promises. Others had been believers who had slowly, painfully realized they had been deceived and had turned against the regime at great personal cost. Some had simply been decent people who could not stand by while their neighbours were deported. Were they all equally worthy of salvation? Did it matter? The Americans seemed to think it did not, or at least that it was not their job to judge. They would leave the questions of German guilt to tribunals and courts, to historians and philosophers. Their job was to feed people, to establish order, to rebuild the physical and social infrastructure. It was a division of labour that was, in its own way, brilliant, separate immediate humanitarian needs from long-term questions of justice and accountability. The object that came to symbolise this entire experience, for Margarete and many others, was the simple ceramic bowl. In the feeding centres, meals were served in sturdy white ceramic bowls, American military surplus, simple and utilitarian. Unlike the metal mess kits of the Wehrmacht or the wooden bowls that had been common in German homes during the war's worst shortages, these bowls spoke of an economy that could afford to equip its army with porcelain, that valued even the mundane details of daily life. Margarete found herself studying the bowl during meals, running her fingers over its smooth surface, noting its weight and solidity. It was, in its way, a perfect symbol of American abundance. It was not fancy, no decorative patterns, no claims to elegance, but it was well made, functional, designed to last. It represented an approach to manufacturing and logistics that Germany had once prided itself on, but had lost during the war years, when everything became ersatz, substitute, make do. The Americans had real things, made from real materials, in quantities that seemed inexhaustible. The bowl reminded her of a story her grandmother had told, about America in the years before the Great War. Her grandmother's cousin had emigrated to New York, and sent back letters describing a land of plenty, where even workers ate meat several times a week, where milk was abundant, where the stores overflowed with goods. The family in Germany had dismissed these letters as exaggeration. The immigrant, she had seen the casual way the soldiers distributed supplies, as if there was always more where that came from. She had heard them talk about home, about the farms in Iowa that stretched for thousands of acres, about the factories in Detroit that churned out vehicles in numbers that seemed impossible, about a continent rich in resources and blessed with peace, untouched by the bombing and destruction that had ravaged Europe. The bowl in her hands represented all of that, the industrial capacity, the agricultural abundance, the organizational skill, the underlying confidence of a nation that could afford to feed its enemies because food was not a scarce resource to be hoarded, but a tool to be deployed for strategic and humanitarian purposes. She was not alone in fixating on these objects. Throughout the feeding centres, Germans picked up the bowls with a kind of reverence, treated them with care that went beyond practical necessity. Some people, she heard, tried to keep the bowls, to take them home as souvenirs or talismans. The Americans generally let them, recognizing perhaps that the psychological value exceeded the monetary cost. These were people who had lived through hell, and if a simple bowl could represent hope and restoration, then let them have the bowl. As the summer progressed into autumn, the character of the occupation evolved. The feeding centres began to close as German infrastructure recovered and local food production increased. The Americans shifted from direct provision to oversight and assistance, helping Germans rebuild their own capacity to feed themselves. It was a deliberate strategy. Teach a man to fish rather than giving him fish forever. But the memory of those first months remained vivid, the image of American soldiers serving hot meals to a defeated population, treating former enemies with a dignity that many had not expected. Margarete attended the closing ceremony for the feeding centre she had worked in. Harrison gave a short speech in his improving German, thanking the volunteers and expressing confidence that Munich would continue to recover. There was a strange atmosphere of sadness mixed with hope. Sadness that this particular chapter was ending. Hope that it was ending because Germans were capable of feeding themselves again. Because normalcy was returning. Because the emergency had passed. Harrison approached Margarete afterward, carrying a cardboard box. "The bowl. Well, I figure you earned it," Harrison said with a smile. "You helped feed thousands of people these past months. The book, I thought you said you studied literature before the war. Maybe it's time to go back to that. Read about the world instead of just surviving in it." Margarete felt tears prick her eyes. She had not cried much during the war years. Tears were a luxury, a weakness that could not be afforded. But now, in this moment of kindness from a man who had once been her enemy, the tears came freely. "Thank you," she said in English, "for all of this. For the food, yes, but also for showing us there is another way." Harrison nodded, understanding deeper than his German vocabulary could express. "We're not perfect," he said. "America isn't perfect. But we try. And we believe people can change, can build something better. I hope you do. I hope Germany does." The years that followed would test that hope in complicated ways. The division of Germany, the Cold War, the long process of denazification and reconstruction, all of it was more complex and morally ambiguous than the simple narrative of liberation and feeding. But for those who experienced those first months after the war, the memory of the feeding centres remained a touchstone, a reminder of possibilities, of what compassion looked like when wielded by the powerful toward the powerless. Margarete did return to literature, eventually earning her doctorate and teaching at the University of Munich. She specialized in American literature, in the poets of democracy like Whitman, in the narratives of immigration and transformation. She kept the ceramic bowl on her desk for decades, using it to hold paperclips and rubber bands, mundane objects contained in a vessel that represented something extraordinary. She gave lectures sometimes, to students who had been born after the war, who knew nothing of hunger or hiding or the desperate years of resistance. She told them about the feeding centres, about the American soldiers who had served hot meals to their defeated enemies. Some students received the stories with skepticism. Surely it had not been that simple, that generous, that clear-cut. American actions in other parts of the world, in Vietnam or Latin America, suggested a more complicated picture, less idealistic motivations. Margarete, whatever the strategic calculations, whatever the geopolitical reasoning, the experience of receiving that care was transformative. It changed what I believed was possible in human affairs. She thought often about that January night in 1945, huddled in the cold cellar, planning resistance operations on an empty stomach, unable to imagine a future beyond the next day's survival. That woman would have been astonished to know what was coming, not just the end of the war, but the manner of its ending, the nature of the occupation, the slow reconstruction not just of buildings, but of the possibility of trust, of hope, of belief in something beyond power and domination. The feeding centres had been a small thing, in the grand scope of the war's end. They had not made headlines, had not been celebrated as great military victories. They were simply one element of the occupation, one program among many in the vast American effort to stabilize and democratize defeated Germany. But for those who experienced them, they represented something profound. The idea that even in the aftermath of the most destructive war in human history, in the rubble of a civilization that had committed unspeakable atrocities, human connection was still possible. Kindness was still powerful, and the future was not fixed, but open to transformation. Margarete lived to see Germany reunified, to see her nation become a prosperous democracy, a leader in Europe, a country that faced its history with painful honesty and built something new from the ruins. She lived to see American and German soldiers serving side by side in international peacekeeping operations, to see the children and grandchildren of soldiers who had once fought each other, now studying together, working together, building together. In her final years, she gave an extended interview to a documentary filmmaker studying the German resistance and the immediate post-war period. The filmmaker asked her what moment stood out most from all those years of struggle and survival. Margarete did not have to think long. "The first time I ate hot chicken soup served by an American soldier," she said. That bowl of soup contained everything that had been lost, and everything that might be recovered. It was warm, and I had been cold for so long. It was nourishing, and I had been hungry for so long. It was freely given, and I had been hunting. We fought the Nazis in the shadows, with printed leaflets and forged papers and small acts of sabotage. We were brave, perhaps, but we were also desperate. What we did mattered, but it was not enough to change Germany's path. The Americans, they changed Germany's path with chicken soup and chocolate bars, and the patient work of demonstrating that democracy was not just an ideology, but a lived experience. They beat us in battle, yes, but more importantly, they won us over with their vision of what peace could look like. That is a kind of power more profound than any weapon. The filmmaker asked if she thought the Americans had been naive, if their idealism had been exploited or proven wrong in the decades since. Margarete smiled, the lines deepening in her aged face. Idealism is only naive if it fails. American idealism about Germany did not fail. We are here, free, democratic, prosperous, at peace. We are what they hoped we might become. Was it perfect? Of course not. Was it complicated? Certainly. But the fundamental belief that people can change, that nations can be redeemed, that kindness is strategic and mercy is powerful, that belief was vindicated. Every time I eat from a bowl, I remember what that belief looked like in practice. The ceramic bowl sits now in a museum in Munich, part of an exhibition on the immediate post-war period. It is displayed alongside other artifacts from the occupation, ration cards and military orders, and photographs of rubble being cleared and buildings being rebuilt. Visitors walk past it, often without noticing, drawn more to the dramatic photographs or the historical documents that tell larger stories. But some stop and read the placard, and learn about Margarete Hoffman, about the resistance she joined and the liberation she witnessed, about the feeding centres and the simple act of serving hot meals to former enemies. Some visitors, particularly older Germans who remember the hunger years, stand before the bowl for a long time, lost in memory. Some younger visitors, Germans and Americans, and people from around the world, pause to consider what the bowl represents. The idea that how you treat the defeated matters, that generosity can be strategic, that the smallest acts of kindness can carry transformative power. The bowl is simple, unremarkable, a utilitarian. It represents the belief, fundamentally American in character but universal in aspiration, that people are not defined by their worst moments, that redemption is possible, that the future is always open to those who have the courage to hope and the wisdom to act on that hope. In a world that often seems to have learned nothing from history, that repeats the same cycles of violence and vengeance, the ceramic bowl stands as a quiet testament to another possibility. It reminds us that in the ruins of Germany in 1945, when hatred and retribution would have been understandable and punishment would have been justified, a different choice was made. Food was shared, dignity was preserved. A door to the future was opened, not through grand rhetoric, but through the simple act of filling a bowl with hot soup and offering it to someone who was hungry. That is the legacy of the feeding centers, of the American soldiers who served meals to German civilians, of the women like Margarete, who experienced not the vengeance they feared, but the grace they had not dared to hope for. It is a legacy written not in monuments or treaties, but in the memory of warmth after cold, of nourishment after hunger, of kindness where cruelty might have reigned. It is the legacy of a bowl of soup, offered freely, transforming everything.